She was spectacularly rude to me in the way that, only Vivian can be.
Ian Kelly is always being asked about his acting role as Hermione's dad in Harry Potter. But we decided to save that question until the end of the conversation, because in fact the truth is that the rest of his career is vastly more interesting, impressive and scholarly. As the author of several books, including a biography of the famous dandy Beau Brummell, Mr. Foote's Other Leg, and the book we'll focus on today as part of our Casanova series, Casanova the Biography, he's outshone many other biographers, uncovered previously unknown historical facts, and was awarded the Biography of the Year by the Sunday Times. We caught up with him as he journeyed through Moscow with his son before he travelled on the Trans-Siberian Express. So, why was he in Moscow? What was it like working on Harry Potter? Who was incredibly rude to him? And did Casanova really help Mozart write Don Giovanni? We found out. How is it going in Moscow at the moment then?
Well, it's great. Well, as you can see here, it's still summer. I mean, astonishingly, I came, with my full Dr. Zhivago kit, and I haven't been able to shirt since. It's a bit disappointing. It's actually predicated on a project I have. It's a play about Shostakovich and Stalin, and it involved some research here and also some meetings with the Russian producers. But it was a long-standing yes, thank you. I'd love to come to Moscow and carry on with it there. And then it has coincided with a rather ridiculous way to get to Los Angeles, which is via the Trans-Siberian Express with my son, who's on his year off. So tell me, how did you come across the Casanova book? This is because of the museum? Hey, there we are.
Actually, let me get a good thumbnail out of that. So I'll do a big...
You know what's really cool, actually, is if you put it in front of your face with your eyes on top.
There we go. Awesome. There you go. Yeah, that's perfect.
There we go.
More handsome as well, which is good.
That is the essential publicity shot.
All right. Okay. I'll go with that one then. You've got a whole select. You've got Beau Brummell. You've got Mr. Foote's Other Leg. You've got Casanova the Biography, which was the Sunday Times Biography of the Year, I believe. Mm-hmm. Which is very impressive. Cooking for Kings. Actually, the one that jumped out to me today was the Vivian Westwood one. How did that happen?
It's a wild card. Well, we always joke that we met in the 18th century, Vivian and myself. No, it was an invitation from her. She had read my book about Beau Brummell, which is quite a lot, I guess, about why you might care about clothes and be able to tell history through fashion, which obviously is something quite near to her heart, because the fashion and the story with Vivian is all about politics and the ideas, if you see what I mean. From punk through into the ecological kind of climate warrior she is now, as well as designer. And so no, it was so happy and unexpected. Did I want to go and have meet Vivian? She'd read my book. We bumped into each other at something at the V&A, something to do with fashion. And I don't think she'd mind my saying, she was spectacularly rude to me in the way that, only Vivian can be. And anyway, so I said, all right.
Can I ask what she said? Can I ask what she said, or is it too rude?
No, it wasn't that, actually. I think I think actually just in the middle of a sentence of, in response to something she said or asked, she just started wandering off and just said, I'm bored now. So, which is a reasonable position, let's face it.
Maybe I'll do, if you don't mind, at some point in the interview, I'm just going to do that and just get out and leave.
Yeah. I find it very endearing, every which way. We used to joke about it years later because, she gets sent, pictures by, kids, young, people who want to be designers. And she'd be opening the mail sometimes when we were writing this book together, and she'd say, "Oh, this is rubbish. I'm going to write back and tell them they've no talent at all." And I said, Vivian, this is a 10-year-old. You can't. But she is scrupulously honest, like that. And there we go. So no, Vivian, yes, I was asked to collaborate on a strange hybrid of a project, which was, not an authorized biography, not a ghosted biography, but a book that was, I thought, half her voice and half the voice of a sort of fashion historian, if you will, trying to, put it in context and tell the story. But it was, insane and unexpected journey. but there we go. But it does actually sort of relate to the 18th century stuff originally. There's a really happy, fascinating new world of history of sex studies as it relates to the 18th century in particular, and what's more recently been termed the first sexual revolution, meaning the 18th century. And in the course of all of that, obviously Casanova is the primary source and figure in terms of a memoir trying to address partly sex and sexuality, love and travel, and so on. I kind of thought, I think I've got some new things to say here, because I can put Casanova in a different sort of context now of, let's be honest about sex and sexuality of any period, but in particular of the 18th century. This is important. This is the birth of, if you will, modern Western sexual liberation. And he's an important writer in all of that. And at the same time, he writes quite a lot about food, even gives you recipes, not in the memoirs, but elsewhere. And I'd had a happy experience publishing a kind of a biography with recipes. So I think I first took that to my publishers as a, look, I think I can do something new with Casanova, which is not Casanova the food writer, and it won't be exactly Casanova and the birth of sex, but somewhere around all of that, there is a new way to tell this story. And also, in the end, as you would know, and thank you, because you got the book, it became quite a lot as well about Casanova and theatricality, because that also struck me as an appropriate way to tell the story of Venice, and also of somebody dealing with the kind of the duality of the 18th century from the perspective really of a performer. He's the son of an actress. He's and maybe actor. We don't know quite who his father really was, and and his world is constantly performative and theatrical, and his writings are a lot about that, the negotiation between the performed and the interior, which is another great gift of the 18th century.
What would it have been like for an actor in Venice at that time? Because it seems, so Zanetta Ferrucci, who's his mother, doesn't seem to be particularly well respected. It's almost like a debauched existence from what I can read in the autobiography, and that she disappears off, she leaves him, she sort of seems to have
there's a number of things. Yeah, sure. No, it's a good question. The world of theatre is very different then. First of all, it should be said, Venice is a great theatre capital in the 18th century. Opera houses, comedy, theatre troupes, commedia dell'arte, and that exports all over Europe. So most every European city has a sort of Venetian opera troupe and or comedy troupe. It's a very odd idea, because Zanetta Ferrucci, his mother, for instance, comes to London in the 1720s, and possibly actually gets pregnant by our very own Prince of Wales then.
Oh, really?
And possibly Francesco Casanova, Giacomo Casanova's brother, the artist, may have been the natural son of the Prince of Wales. Anyway, but she's performing.
Is he the one that did the drawing of him that we see quite often? There's a profile drawing, isn't there?
Yes, exactly so. Yeah, that's from the 1750s. Casanova's about 25 or so, and yes, that is Francesco. Absolutely, quite a fine draftsman. Though he became famous for sort of battle paintings and landscapes and the like. I mean, he's rather good if you like that kind of thing. It's interesting, that one, because he is not handsome by the modern standards or understanding of, but clearly was thought so at the time, and immensely tall, maybe 6'2" or so, quite a presence. But sorry, back to the theatre. No, my own point was there. I was always bemused with Zanetta. There she is at the Haymarket performing seemingly Italian comedy in London in the 1720s. So there's this whole career for Venetians all over Europe, and that's why he saw so little of his mother. She was a touring, working actress, but in an era when to be an actress, implied a duality of career. There was quite a lot of crossover between the world of being a courtesan and being an actress, and one gets the impression that is the boards that Zanetta Ferrucci trod. But she's an important actress. She's a muse to Carlo Goldoni, the great sort of comic writer of Commedia dell'arte, and possibly has an affair with the theatre owner and also the theatre runner, sort of manager, Ymer, who's the father of Teresa Ymer. I get ahead of myself. It is, you're right, an exciting world to be in. And it's not dissimilar in effect from what we know also of, I don't know, being an actor in Shakespeare's London, let alone the Restoration stage, where, you know, you are both applauded and derided all at once. You are actually, you know, a celebrity, but also a rogue and vagabond. And you are, as an actress, both a goddess and a whore. And that is the fascinating position that they inhabit. And it begins to shift in London, partly because of Joshua Reynolds, who loved painting actresses, you know, as goddesses. But even then, you know, it's an uncomfortable duality to the modern way of looking at these things. I mean, how much power did these women really have through being exploited for their sexuality? In part, is very much open to debate and conversation, obviously. But that is his world. Yes, that is the world he comes from, and therefore all his travels all over Europe are predicated actually by very often, you know, arriving in a new city and getting to know the local Venetians very fast, because every city, you know, had some. In the opera house, you know, in Prague, they're doing the you know, the premiere eventually of Don Giovanni and Clemente di Tito for Mozart. They're Venetian singers, and it's the same in London when he arrives there, and Moscow when he arrives here, where I'm speaking from. It's a unexpectedly cosmopolitan world, and you get the impression, wonderful world in which to be Venetian, because you are coming from the coolest, sexiest, most sophisticated city that has this kind of reputation for art and music and sophistication, but also for sexual license.
You mentioned Mozart there. How true do you think his claims are that he helped Mozart with Don Giovanni?
Well, it's entirely plausible. And this isn't my research. It's musicologists in the 1920s who first came across the notes in the Prague State Archive, and I've looked at them as well. There's an awful lot of stuff there from Casanova, including, from memory, it's Act 2, Scene 2 of Don Giovanni. Lorenzo da Ponte supposedly wrote the libretto, or did write the libretto, but wasn't in Prague when it was premiered. And we know that Mozart was frantically trying to finish it. And somebody finished off bits and pieces of the libretto, and it seems entirely plausible that it would be Giacomo Casanova, old friend of Lorenzo da Ponte, or frenemy, and there is the evidence to an extent in that, you know, why would he be just copying down Lorenzo da Ponte's words? It's entirely plausible. He is there, definitely 1787 from memory. And yes, that's the connection, as well as, of course, it connects kind of the man and the legend. It's like, you know, Don Juan, Don Giovanni, and Casanova all in one building and one story, all at once. It's a magical sort of a moment and idea. And we do know that he was there at the premiere, and yes, he alludes to having been an inspiration for all of this. And you certainly get the impression that he and Lorenzo da Ponte, who met up variously all over Europe, did, you know, talk about their glory days and were, you know, putting together their own catalogue song, as it were. So, you know, it connects variously, but there is a textual link. Yes.
Didn't he say so? They asked him, didn't they, if he liked it, if he liked Don Juan, and I think he said, like it, I've lived it. I think he said, didn't he?
Yeah, words to that effect. I could never actually quite, you know, nail the truth of that story, but it's in my book anyway. That's worth quoting as a possibility. It's a good line.
Yeah. What do you think he was like? I mean, you know, what's your sense of what he was like as a man? Because obviously some of the things he did were quite reprehensible, but then he's got this sort of frankness about him in the autobiography as well. And there's this strange thing, isn't there, where he's gone from it's almost like his reputation is in transition, where he's gone from sort of a lying joke, and as time goes on, he's being more and more recognized as an intellectual, and as what he said becomes more corroborated, he's having to be taken a bit more seriously now, isn't he, as time has gone on?
Oh gosh, very much so.
Yeah.
I mean, we live in a tradition, the Anglophone tradition, where he got, roundly trashed as a fantasist and an erotic fantasist, and in a sense, kind of worse than that, as it were, not a gentleman, just a notcher of bedposts and a man who wrote about it, So no. It's a horrible accident of publishing, really. All of that legend is posthumous. He never intended that, I think, to be widely known. It's very difficult to believe that he properly intended the memoir, the Histoire de ma vie, History of My Life, to be published, because it's just unpublishably long. It was written partly as a cure for his melancholia, and it's about everything. It's about absolutely everything he could remember, all sorts of ephemera, which is terribly useful to the social historian. Hence all the food. But also, he's frank and seemingly full disclosure about his sex life and love life, for good and ill, because he also tells you quite a lot about romantic and sexual failure. And there aren't many male writers who do that. But he also tells you a lot of stories which are very much to his detriment, if you will, the potential of his reputation. Anyway, yes, within the last few decades, or sort of since the 1970s, really, there's more and more corroborative evidence that actually, although he gets dates and facts wrong from time to time, as we all would writing a memoir, sometimes reaching back many decades, there's no particular reason to doubt much of what he says. And in terms of the idea of him as an erotic fantasist, some of what I was doing, amongst other historians at the moment, was putting it in the context of what we now know of many other people of the 18th century or any century, who may or may not settle down with one person and may or may not choose to, as it were, tell their shrink about it, which is almost what he's doing there. It's just a sort of a full and frank confession for good or ill. But it's it's a lot more about love and falling in love than it is about sex or the sex act per se. So yeah,
and he did fall in love he fell in love quite dramatically with Henriette, didn't he? Do you think it would have been an entirely different story if he had stayed with Henriette? I mean, in terms of his philandering, would he? Because he seemed to be completely absorbed with her at the time, but then she left, didn't she?
Well, yeah, she was married, but
I didn't know that bit.
Yes. Well, I think he's writing as an old man, trying to make sense of his life, and the extent to which there is a regret. You get a sense of that with the story of Henriette, for sure. But as with others, but not exactly, I think, with an idea, which I would argue is maybe our, if you will, post-romantic worldview, that there should be, the other who will, solve and make us whole. That ancient story, and for some people, yes, and for others, not, or or a series of, and he is, to use that a compelling Richard Curtis phrase, a serial monogamist. And it is that is the story there. And whether actually, I don't know, the great contenders, Manon Balletti, Henriette, also Teresa Lanti or Landi, probably, Bellino, the singer, whether any of these women might have been the one that would have changed everything is yeah, it's interesting speculation, but it's almost the same as asking the story of why did he keep on traveling and changing careers? Well, that was the life story. That was, yes, his restive spirit, and that was also the travelogue he was trying to make sense of late in his life, and he was very unhappy late in his life, and to that extent, yes, you feel this sort of pall of an idea of potentially regret and nostalgia, which is quite closely related to a memory of romance, I suppose. So yeah, I mean, it's you could see it as some sad, except to say it's a strange quality the memoirs have, that he's also celebrating what he can remember of a sensual universe that he recalls quite clearly and sometimes very well. And rather in the same way that it's written just after the French Revolution as a testament to the world that has gone, everything that was before. It has that same sort of quality where he is enjoying the reminiscence whilst also, accepting that it has gone. And so
he's writing this, for people who don't know, at the end of his life when he's a librarian in Dux.
The patron saint of librarians, Casanova. A lot of time on his hands, a lot of paper, and yeah. Well, he may have been suffering from some kind of more extended depressive condition, but seemingly a local doctor suggested that he write as a cure for his melancholia, and he writes and he writes and he writes. And yes, and this is what we have. And in brief, the story, I mean, he a lot of his papers, were just left there at the castle where he was a librarian. The castle got kind of nationalized in 1948, which is why his archive is all in Prague. Thousands and thousands of scribblings, mathematics and opera libretti and poetry and recipes, and it's amazing. And also this history of my life. And his niece had it, and his niece's husband read some of it and thought, I think we can make some money out of all of this. And this is by then the sort of 1840s from memory. And it's first translated from the original French into German and then mistranslated into English, but not the whole thing. I mean, just the little bits they thought would sell.
So he's not widely known until the 40s then?
Yeah. Oh, sure. He has a minor fame in his own lifetime, largely as a result of another little bit of memoir, the Histoire de ma fuite, the history of my escape, a little sort of pamphlet, if you will, explaining how he escaped from the prison of the Venetian Inquisition. And it's a great boy's own sort of escape from cold. It's kind of a story. And he told this story all around Europe and then eventually wrote about it a bit. And he wrote, various other things. I mean, dear God, a history of Poland, mathematical treatises, a science fiction novel about a mythical England. I mean, it's bizarre, but none of it was very successful at all. And his brothers were much more famous than he was. Francesco, the painter, and Giovanni, head of the Dresden Arts Institute. And Casanova was semi-forgotten, really. So it's a strange posthumous fame because he might be shocked and surprised and maybe even appalled by his reputation in the 21st century as a Lothario and a ne'er-do-well, because he was a fiercely proud polymath and intellectual, aspiring philosophe, and and a difficult individual. You get the impression, certainly by the end of his life, he falls out with plenty of friends, and kind of irascible and difficult, but partly out of the let me tell you about that time I met Catherine the Great, and Frederick the Great, and or whatever, and it was all true. But you kind of think, God, he must have been the most boring old librarian, in the history, or rather, cursed with prolixity. So that's maybe why he was told to write about it instead.
Didn't he get attacked in town in Dux by somebody who was fed up listening to him?
Yeah, like I say, it's a sad part of the story, because yes, he's old, he's ill, he's frail, he's he occasionally kind of emigre French aristocrats are coming to Plitza, the spa nearby, and he can meet people he used to know back in his glory days, but he's incredibly lonely. And yeah, and then gets kind of mugged in the street. It's a horrible end, and they've lost the grave essentially. He was just this sort of this eccentric old Venetian, didn't know what to do with him, I think. And happily though, the papers survived, and majorly happily for all of us, the Histoire de ma vie survived. And it is an extraordinary document. I mean, there are very few memoirists who've ever tried to do something quite as comprehensive. He's arguably one of the first. He's arguably one of the first people to also address this idea of interiority, and bravely to address sexuality and sexual practice. So for all of that, I have a sort of respect for him as a writer and an adventurer, whilst at the same time, yes, you never want to be an apologist. It's not your job as a biographer, as a historian anyway. It is a different moral universe, and some of what he does would now be considered deeply reprehensible, indeed illegal, and there's nothing good to be said about that. But the fact that actually he writes, that it becomes, of course, a subject of fascination. Let's be clear about that we are, interested. Bridget Brophy, the Irish feminist writer, has a wonderful line that the two most interesting things in the world are sex and the 18th century. And, people are drawn to him because oh, wow, you dared to write about, your sexual career, its joys and raptures, but also its tragedies and failures. And that issue, that kind of vibrant hue within Western literature, memoir, but also culture of, let's be honest, this is something that lights up some of our existence as human beings, and also the freedoms born of that era are incredibly important, and it is the beginnings of sexual liberation. It is also a hell of a story, and he's a hell of a rogue, and to an extent dramatically we're a little bit drawn to that, of wow, that's brave and wrong, but I'll listen to that story of what it is to constantly be traveling and reinventing yourself, and perpetually falling in love, or thinking he is. So
yeah. So as we're approaching his the 300th anniversary of his birth, really, how do you think he's ultimately going to remember? Do you think it will continue to be evolved, and we'll start to see him as a fuller figure, or is this kind of Lothario myth going to just maintain?
That's a good question. I mean, I liked to think, like any writer historian, I suppose, that I was trying to slightly reposition, and there are other people who are around that same issue, I suppose, that there is something more interesting here than a Lothario, definitely, but let us also be grown up about our interest in that part of what he's choosing to address. You don't ever shrug off becoming an adjective, a legend like that. And there's a ballet that's based on my book, and I co-wrote the scenario with the wonderful choreographer Kenneth Tyndall. It's his ballet for Northern Ballet, and it's coming back into the UK and into Sadler's Wells next year. And I was trying to make it a lot about, as was he, and rightly, the women, the world, and acknowledging that this was just a writer and a story that gave us a way in, a sort of a narrative to many worlds that he was attempting to capture. Kenny, the choreographer, though, said something wonderful to me at one stage. He said, well, of course, I'm drawn to this because it's about the distance between people. He said, dance is about the spaces between dancers and the connections that you try to make. And that is what Casanova's writings are maybe also about, is trying to make sense of a life retrospectively, but also to make sense of a life that was fascinated by people, humanity, women in particular. But it's not as if there weren't, many men in his life as well. Indeed, sexually to an extent. I got kind of called out by the Italian press, and a British historian claims Casanova was gay, which I didn't. But he is fairly honest about broad and Catholic experience, Catholic with a small c, or big. People come with their own ideas of what this story and this man is. The facts, as it were, so far as we, properly know them. That is you always with biography. There's the life and there's the argument for the life. And the life is very dramatic and very sexy, and it's an amazing story. And for good or ill, he did what he did. The argument for the life is a lot to do with what he writes, of course, and how he tries to make sense of it. And then also what we know and now have as a kind of a lodestar for a whole series of ideas. And therefore, the meaning of Casanova will rightly keep on shifting, because it's partly very specific to its own era and that man and that extraordinary accident of a life. The writings, however, will continue to move and intrigue and touch people, and also challenge them, because on the one hand, it is a life very bravely lived, you could argue, and with a different moral universe to the one that now pertains. But something about the joyousness of some of what he's trying to talk about, what I write about as a man on the sandbanks laughing at the rising tide, is also some of the continuing power and importance of him as a writer, because it is about the magic of now, the celebration of the life and living and loving, including sex, but also including, how to cook the perfect omelet. I mean, he'll tell you interesting, and that will continue to resonate differently through the ages, I suppose. I don't think they'll do much in Venice, in 2025. They're a bit bemused and embarrassed by him, I think, and because they're much more aware of the legend. And also, of course, he wasn't in Venice much. He's exiled and he writes in French and becomes a naturalized Frenchman and so on. So, so there we go. And sometimes, though, you do get people saying, and rightly, actually, the love story really for Giacomo Casanova is with Venice. And the place he actually couldn't get back to through most of his life. And therefore that issue of also a Venetian, dealing with the rising tide always struck me as an amazing, metaphor for a man and for the relevance now.
To finish off, it'd be nice to bring it back to your own career a little bit as well. When I was reading through your CV, three things sort of stuck out for me. One was that you were part of Cold Lazarus. Two, also because I really enjoyed that when it was on years ago. And then two, Tom Stoppard's Arcadia, and then obviously to finish off, how you got involved with the Harry Potter project. So to begin with, or to end with, to begin the end with. What was it like working on the whole Dennis Potter thing then on Cold Lazarus?
It was an astonishing honor because it was going to be Dennis Potter's last filmed thing. He was dying and he died, of course. And therefore I remember at the read through this great sense of sort of the import of it, if you see what I mean. I remember sitting by Francis de la Tour, and we had a conversation about this and that, and and yes, I didn't realize at the time that very often, telly is sort of flung together, and this had a, it had a budget, had a sense of importance. Mainly, I remember the fact that, I was asked to play a 25th century sex slave wearing a silver spandex jockstrap and cowboy boots. Yeah, God, it's it's a long way from where my career's gone subsequently.
And action.
Don't really. So there are some very comedic memories from all of that, both costume fittings and hair and makeup and all the rest. Anyway, I should move swiftly on. Oh, but I was playing a boyfriend, toy boy, for wonderful American actress called Diane Ladd, who was of a certain age and beyond at the time. And we first met properly because she hadn't been in the read-through, and she declined all rehearsal for all of this. And we first met, in a bed with her in a space age basque and me in nothing much. Anyway, but because, just to kind of break the ice, because there she was wearing all of this. I said, it's great honor to meet you. I'm a great fan of your work, Miss Ladd, whatever nonsense. How nice it must be for you to be working in your own clothes. Just struck me as I don't know, tough thing to say. Anyway, she just stared at me, and the whole set went quiet for a second. And then there was this devastating line that, only from an American. She said, "Oh, you're funny." And it was one of those, well, clearly not. So that was the beginning of our sex scene, and pretty much the end of my career as a screen gigolo. So there was that, and oh God, the madness of it. These are what are called roles of insulting brevity. I mean, I've done all sorts of terribly important theatre work you don't want to talk about, but I have also appeared in the Harry Potter franchise for a blink and a half as Hermione's dad. But that's a lovely thing to be part of. But obviously it carries on and on.
Yeah.
And but Arcadia, I mean, of course, was right up my alley. I loved that. I love for those of your listeners, viewers, you don't know it. It's a stop-art play, but it's a split time zone. It happens in the same room, but partly in round about 1815 and partly in the present day. And then eventually the characters from different eras are there all together. So it's got this wonderful kind of ghosted quality that obviously spoke to me as a historian and actor, and I just loved it. So the happy, great honor cut to some years later, my first play, which was an adaptation of my book, Mr. Foote's Other Leg, about Georgian comedian, transfers into the West End, to the Haymarket, with Simon Russell Beale and all. And it was very exciting, of course, as you can imagine. It was tremendously exciting, but obviously was when I suddenly realized that Tom Stoppard was there, and was very flattering about it all. So there we go. I'll put that on my gravestone.
It's been an absolute delight, and I really appreciate the time that you've given me. And I've learned a lot and really enjoyed it as well. So thank you very much.
Well, my absolute pleasure. It's a man and a period about whom, for which, whatever, I maintain a particular passion. It's lovely to get away from Moscow and be back in London and Venice with you. So
thank you.
Thank you.
All right, take care. I'll return you to Moscow now. Take care. Thanks very much.